Hello everybody and welcome to Drydock episode 97. Today's questions are taken from the videos on HMS Eagle and the video on the Mark 14 torpedo. F12MNB asks, why wasn't more research work put into torpedoes? They always seem to be regarded by most navies in World War I and World War II as a secondary weapon. Was the dominance of gunnery admirals a factor? It basically comes down to two factors, one of which is how much money have they got at the time, and the second of which is how viable is the torpedo relative to other weapons at the time. So initially when the torpedo is invented, it's seen as a potential game changer, and a lot of research goes into it in the latter part of the 19th century, and kind of a little bit into the early 20th. Because whilst the torpedo is relatively short range, the very first models having ranges measured in a few hundred yards and later a few thousand, the fact is that gun range, effective gun range that is, isn't much greater. So a torpedo obviously lets a lot of water in the bottom, and most ships at the time weren't designed in any way, shape or form to deal with that kind of impact and explosive, which made them theoretically vastly more effective on a per weapon basis as compared to shells, which normally tend to let air in the top and set fire to things, which takes a lot longer to put a ship down. And of course, ship's armour protection was rigged around that. So if you had a weapon that, okay, it cost a bit more than a shell, but you could allow you to maybe one-shot a battleship, and could be used at similar ranges, or possibly even towards the end of the 19th century, even greater ranges than a gun, then obviously this could be a massive change. And so lots of money and time went into that. The French based the Jellicoe in part around torpedoes. However, along comes Admiral Sims in the US, I believe it is, and obviously Admiral Fisher in the UK, and various other similar admirals follow their course in other navies, and they bring all these navies' gunnery ranges up significantly with the invention of rangefinders, fire control, and just better gunnery practices generally. And this results in gun ranges suddenly going from, give or take, about the same as contemporary torpedoes to 10 times that far in a matter of maybe half a decade, and torpedoes can't match that. I mean, they extend the range and they increase the lethality of the torpedo, sure, but by the time you hit the end of the 1900s, going into the 1910s, naval gunnery can reach out far, far further than any torpedo can. And so all of a sudden the torpedo is now a secondary weapon for close range battles, for light craft, and for the emerging submarines. Although obviously on the lighter craft and on the submarines it's kind of a primary weapon, but in the grand scheme of battle, the deciding engagement, it is a secondary weapon. Now, once you get into the interwar period, obviously there's massive funding cutbacks as well. So whilst they still do want to increase the range of torpedoes, there's an awful long way to go to try and get them to match or even approach the range of battleship guns. And so a lot of work focuses more on the delivery platforms, be that destroyers, submarines, cruisers, the odd battleship here and there, with a few attempts to increase range, but more particularly lethality, because the experiences of many ships being torpedoed in World War I resulted in large numbers of anti-torpedo defence measures being enacted, whether that be bulges for pre-existing ships or more comprehensive torpedo defence systems in newer ships. So it was more about trying to increase the bang that you got out of them. Now, of course, in certain navies, such as the Japanese, where they viewed torpedoes as one of the primary equalizers in their projected fight with the US Navy, particularly, you ended up with them doing a lot more research into torpedoes that could reach out a heck of a lot further, torpedoes that could possibly even match or exceed the range of certain naval guns, certainly the guns on cruisers and destroyers, and from that you end up with the long lance. But by World War II, long lance aside, again, torpedoes are still a secondary weapon for pretty much everything except destroyers when they're facing capital ships, and submarines for obvious reasons. So whilst funding obviously goes up quite significantly, again, it's not so much looking at trying to make torpedoes a range-based replacement for guns, it's more about improving their secondary characteristics. Speed being one, so navies were prepared to accept a marginal increase in range if it meant the torpedo could go a lot faster over that range. Lethality, again, with the invention of things like torpex, and also, of course, guidance with the invention of various guided torpedoes, both remote and on-board guidance systems. And of course, you've also got to remember that, well, a shell is a shell is a shell. You can have a high explosive version and an armour-piercing version, but for a given type of warship, whether that's battleship or cruiser or whatever, that's basically as far as it goes. Whereas with a torpedo, if you're going to introduce a new generation of torpedoes to your fleet, the requirements for a destroyer-launched or cruiser or battleship-launched torpedo versus the requirements for a submarine-launched torpedo versus the requirements for an aerial torpedo are very different. So there's also a lot more different ways you have to split the funding when you're trying to improve your torpedo arsenal. Weeb Extraordinaire asks a question that proved very popular in Eagle and Hermes' videos. He says, you mentioned Eagle being sent to hunt pirates together with Hermes. This is immensely amusing, but what exactly did her missions look like? Was it mostly using aircraft for recon, or did they have an active role in subduing the pirates? So, historically, China has always had something of a pirate problem for most of its history, whether that be foreign pirates or local pirates who just decided they didn't like the emperor or empress's authority all that much. And, well, it might sound surprising that significant amounts of pirates were still operating in the early 20th century off of the Chinese coast, but to be perfectly fair, the various colonial powers had done a fairly good job of breaking China in the latter part of the 19th century, what with the various opium wars and the response to the Boxer uprising, and then, of course, the Sino-Japanese wars in their latest incarnations. Chinese central authority was, shall we say, somewhat diminished and trying to pick itself up again. Not, of course, to mention that during the majority of the interwar period, the Chinese were actually having an on-again, off-again civil war, which somewhat also diminishes central governmental authority. So in all that, it may come as no surprise that the various pirate organisations that had existed before either continued to exist or resurged, and whilst their activity on the major waterways in China was to a certain extent largely curtailed by the various gunboat squadrons that the various colonial powers were using, as well as obviously the local Chinese efforts where they could, there was also something of an elephant in the room in that China has a very, very long coast. And so without sort of any real central power to actually get rid of them or resist anybody else's efforts to get rid of them, then ships that were on what for the UK was the China station were perfectly placed to deal with them because, of course, pirates were a nuisance to everybody concerned. And, well, the Chinese didn't really have much ability to resist UK carrier strikes on what was technically their own soil. And, well, they probably didn't care too much for the pirates anyway. But in terms of what those missions looked like, partly it was to do with protecting and recovering shipping that had been captured or was being harassed by pirates. That was a sort of a front and centre part, making it safe for generalised shipping. But also, the aircraft would recon for pirate bases and then also launch full-on strike missions against those pirate bases. And the carriers were very handy for this because obviously, one, you could search a lot of larger an area using a carrier's air wing, and then you could using a, let's say, a cruiser squadron, and you could search it a lot faster. And also, the pirates had centuries of experience of looking out for enemy warships and then scuttling off to various hiding places. What they didn't have much experience with was the third dimension of view that was afforded by aircraft, nor indeed the speed of aircraft. Okay, fair enough, they're biplanes, but they're still 5-6 times faster than the average cruiser operating at full pelt. So yeah, their methods of hiding and a lot of the defences that they put up that would make it awkward for a smaller warship to try and approach them didn't really work when aircraft could just fly over everything and start dropping bombs. So yeah, there's a whole background to the Hermes and Eagle's anti-pirate operations that will probably merit its own video at some point, but that's the summary version. Scott Ayers asks, how much was the aerodynamics of the superstructure of ships from the pre-Dreadnought age through to the King George V tested and refined compared to the hydrodynamics of the hull? An excellent question, and it depends quite a bit depending on the type of ship that is being designed and also on the era that you're talking about. They knew in general that obviously large flat-sided structures cause a lot of wind resistance, and there was also a fair drive to keep the superstructure level down anyway, because as we've gone on about in multiple videos, lots of structure high up causes instability, so they wanted to keep everything fairly low down anyway. So in the earlier period, the pre-Dreadnought era, the aerodynamics was not so much of a concern, partly because, let's say, the stability was the more practical concern, but also because, well, superstructures weren't that high anyway, and with the best will in the world, these ships weren't going particularly quick, so air resistance probably wasn't going to be too much of a problem. Now, as time went on, ships obviously get bigger, ships go faster, then it starts to become a much larger issue, because, well, when we start going faster through the water, the resistance mounts up exponentially, and pretty much the same thing for going through the air. And with bigger ships comes bigger superstructure, more wind resistance, etc. So, yeah, it is definitely much more of an issue. However, with that said, there are two factors at this point that kind of split things out. So one is, as we mentioned before, what kind of ship you're talking about, whether it's a small ship like a destroyer or a medium-sized ship like a light cruiser, or a big ship like a heavy cruiser or a battleship. And the other part that's related to it is the square cube law, which is obviously where if you increase the linear dimension by a factor of, say, 2, you increase the area by a factor of 4, but you increase the volume by a factor of 8. Now what this means is that the surface area to volume ratio goes down the larger the ship gets. And this means that when you have a look at something like, say, a destroyer, the destroyer is, relatively speaking, quite small, but also is actually going pretty quick. So it's going to have more air resistance to deal with than a larger ship because it's going faster. And because it's going to have a much higher surface area to volume ratio, then the impact of air resistance on the ship is going to be higher because of that as well. So for destroyers and small cruisers, the aerodynamics of a superstructure are much, much more important. Whereas for a battleship, the battleship is not going to be moving as fast as a destroyer, so the proportional air resistance is less. But also, because it's so much larger, its surface area to volume ratio is a lot closer, a lot lower, which means that with all the engine power plant internally providing the push to make it go through the water, it's going to have a lot more power behind it, and thus air resistance is going to be less of a factor. And so the aerodynamics of the ship's superstructure on a battleship are going to be something less of an issue as compared to a destroyer. And there's also the fact, well, you've got to design the superstructure of a battleship to withstand a lot more interesting things like incoming fire, theoretically, of some caliber, and also the blast of your own guns. Now, there were a few weird and wonderful effects that came about that people didn't necessarily quite anticipate, such as the very rear-mounted superstructure on the Nelsons causing some odd wind sail effects when they were trying to maneuver in a crosswind. But generally speaking, the aerodynamics for a battleship superstructure were studied, because obviously it still improved efficiency, and a superstructure on a battleship, especially when you're talking about something like the Queen Anne mentioned layout, is a fair bit of surface area. but it was a much cruder study as compared to something like a destroyer or a light cruiser, where there would be an awful lot of work that went into working out exactly how little superstructure you could get away with and what superstructure you had to put in, and quite how you'd shape that to reduce air resistance. Sreko Kuvalo, I think, asks, can a ship maintain accurate fire while it's listing or sinking, or is going down fighting useless in a tactical sense? In absolute terms, yes, you can maintain fire, and to a certain degree accurate fire, whilst you're listing or sinking. It depends on exactly how you've ended up in that situation, though. Let's say, for example, actually Bismarck is a good example, because Bismarck goes into its final fight with a list, but it's still able to maintain fairly accurate fire for the first part, at least until its fire control systems get blown into tiny pieces, courtesy of HMS Rodney. And at that point, well, the local fire control stations within the turrets don't get that much to do before they're completely silenced. Whereas if you look at something like, say, HMS Marlborough at the Battle of Jutland, when she's torpedoed, she holds her place in the line, and although there is progressive flooding and she is listing more and more and more, she does keep up relatively accurate gunfire until such point as the angle of the list gets too much for her to actually fire her guns far enough at the enemy, which is one of the main problems, because unless you have guns that can elevate to a truly ridiculous angle, for the majority of battleships, once your ship starts listing much beyond about 5 or 6 degrees, whilst you can still elevate your guns above the horizontal, the fact is it's the upper elevations that carry the shells the furthest, so whilst you may still be able to fire the guns may not be able to actually reach the target. Now, of course, if you are sinking very quickly, like say HMS Barham, then you're not going to be doing accurate firing, or any firing, to be honest, because you're going down far too fast. So yeah, it depends on the speed of your sinking and the manner of the sinking as well, because if you've been hit by a torpedo or some kind of underwater detonation, that's not necessarily going to affect the accuracy of your fire control systems or your guns. So as long as you can still bear on the target, and as long as the relative overall elevation of the ship plus your guns can allow you to reach the target, then sure, you can keep up an accurate fire as you go down. Even better if you're settling on an even keel. However, if the opposites happen and somebody has put your ship into a sinking condition by battering you to pieces with shell fire, the chances are pretty much anything you've got capable of maintaining accurate fire at anything other than the shortest possible ranges has probably been smashed to bits at this point. So there's probably not a tremendous amount of sense in continuing, nor is there really probably going to be much option to do so. Although, again, various battles did see that kind of thing occur when circumstances permitted. For example, the last stand of HMS Blücher in the First World War. She was going down relatively quickly, and she had been battered to bits by shell fire, but the 1 or 2 operational guns she had left by the end did keep firing pretty much right up until the end. Although, again, this actually did serve a certain amount of tactical purpose, because while she was firing, she drew the attention of various British battlecruisers, who then weren't shooting at all the other German battlecruisers that were trying to make their escape. Robert Rowe asks, was it really possible for the Soviet Union steel industry to build the Sovietsky-Soyuz battleship's armour to match the armour found on a Royal Navy or US Navy battleship? Or was there no way that the Russians could build battleships capable of challenging Western countries? No way and never are very absolute terms, and I certainly wouldn't go as far as that. What I would say is that at the time that the Russians were building them, there was no real way that their industry was going to provide a ship that on a ton-for-ton basis could match Royal Navy or US Navy battleships at the time. Now, similar, not exactly similar to, but related to, and in somewhat ways like the Bismarck, that doesn't mean they wouldn't have been significant threats. I mean, a ship of the kind of displacement the Sovietsky Soyuzes were planned at with the armament that they've got, they're bigger and meaner on paper than the vast majority of ships that the Western Allies either had built or were building. So they would still have been a massive threat, but like the Bismarck, they would have been an inefficient design. So, yeah, take a Sovietsky Soyuz up against a 40,000 ton Allied battleship, and chances are relatively good that, all other factors being equal, the Sovietsky Soyuz could probably win that fight. But if you would, say, put Sovietsky Soyuz up against something in its own weight class, like a particularly overdone Montana, then I would quite comfortably give the advantage, in that case, to the US ship. Now, in terms of the armour in particular, as we've covered in the armour video and mentioned a couple of other times, this is a very specialist niche industry, and Soviet industry at the time was not capable of producing large, good quality, face-hardened armour plating at the thicknesses required to have single monolithic slabs of armour. They could produce slightly thinner layers and put them together and form a kind of laminate, but that is not as effective as a single piece. There's a similar issue to pretty much what the US Navy faced when it was trying to fight the American Civil War. They couldn't initially produce sort of 4.5, 5-inch thick armour the way that the French and the British could, but they could build up very thick armour by layering lots of individual plates together, even if the final result wasn't as effective as its on-paper thickness. Now, of course, the US Navy would go on to develop that technology later down the line, and similarly with the Russians, there's no magical secret to doing this. It's just very big forging and metal production facilities and a certain amount of professional expertise which you can grow. So if battleships had continued to be a thing, and assuming that the Russians continued to worry about building some, then probably, I'd say maybe it would take them 5 to 10 years to come up with all the infrastructure that could support the construction of the probably 16 to 18-inch thick armour plates that they would have needed by then to a sufficient quality to be competitive. So they could have done it, given time, but during the Second World War, no. But you've got to remember, that's not to rule out other aspects of Russian ship construction. There were deficient aspects, to be sure. Just look at the design history of the Kirov-class cruisers, if you want any evidence of that. But at the same time, the Russians were pretty darn good at building guns. At least, well, in the Kirov's case, they didn't work too well, but the Gangut's 12-inch guns were pretty solid. They certainly had the expertise somewhere lying around, assuming they hadn't sent them all to Gulag. So it's fairly possible the Russians could have built some ships with really nice guns, but we'll never know. Josh Thomas Moore asks, which navy, German, Italian or Japanese, posed the biggest threat to the Allies for the longest time? Well, if you include the longest time part, then, well, the Kriegsmarine takes the biscuit because they were the only one of those three navies that were operational for the entirety of World War II. Obviously, the Italians coming in and then the Japanese, and the Italians taking a bit of an early retirement. However, if you look at the various periods throughout the war, who poses the biggest threat actually does shift, and you've also got to take into account that it's not just a tactical threat of which navy could potentially sink the most of our ships, it's also a strategic threat of does that actually matter to the overall outcome of the war. So up until 1940, obviously Kriegsmarine takes the biscuit because they're the only navy that's involved in the war, and their U-boat threat will remain a persistent issue. Now, when it comes to 1940 through 43-ish, actually the single biggest threat, I would argue, would probably be, in strategic terms, the Italian Navy. Because whilst the U-boat arm of the Kriegsmarine is, as I said, very definitely a threat and something that needs to be countered, the surface elements of the Kriegsmarine, not so much. I mean, once the Channel Dash has occurred and Bismarck has been sunk, which is sort of early 41, the Kriegsmarine's surface element is a threat to individual convoys, but as a strategic threat, it is contained. Whereas the Italian surface navy, if they have enough fuel and the willingness to come out, is a much, much larger threat, because on a strategic level, they could potentially cause Malta to fall. They could shut off shipping through the Mediterranean. The interdiction they did at the time was incredibly annoying and contributed quite a bit in terms of expenses, etc., to the Allied war effort, in terms of making them spend more money, etc., sending ships around Africa. They had a lot more ships. I mean, if you put, say, the 1942 Kriegsmarine up in a nice big battle line and line it up against the Royal Navy, it's going to go down causing far less damage than if you lined up the mid-1942 Italian Regia Marina lineup. They would do a heck of a lot more damage to the Royal Navy before they went down. And of course, if the Italian Navy managed to gain dominance of the Mediterranean, then they can ensure a lot more supplies to North Africa, and once North Africa goes, if it goes, then there's a whole load of strategic dominoes leading straight towards some rather nice oil fields over in the Middle East. Now, you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, wasn't there this whole Pearl Harbor thing and, the takeover of the Western Pacific by the Japanese Navy? Yes, there was. But whilst that's a tactical threat, and yes, that did cause a lot of sinking of Allied ships, strategically, not so much, because who are the Japanese going after? Well, they're going after various Allied colonies. Okay, they can take those. That's a problem. But where are the big threats? Well, if they go after India, but is the Japanese Navy going after India? No, it's supposedly the Japanese Army. Australia? Can the Japanese Navy get to Australia? Potentially, but it's going to cost them. And although there are invasion scares and such, realistically, a Japanese attempted invasion of Australia is probably going to go fairly badly in any semi-plausible timeline. But the bigger elephant in the room is, of course, America, and whilst Japan has managed to strike at Pearl Harbor, what are the chances of the Japanese sending any major fleet elements to operate off the west coast, or even more hilariously, try and invade the west coast? Yeah, not so much, is it? So whilst the Japanese are a massive tactical threat, there's not a tremendous amount the Japanese Navy can actually do strategically to change the overall outcome of the war. It's, as has often been discussed, even if the Japanese managed to drive the American carrier and battleship forces from the sea in 1942 somehow and sink them all, unless they've got some ability to go and operate off both the US east and west coasts, the Americans are just going to show back up with an Essex and Fletcher swarm a few years later and really make the Japanese regret that particular decision. So, yeah, as a strategic threat, the Italians during that period probably a lot more of a threat than the Japanese. Now, once the Italians are out of the war, you've only got the Kriegsmarine and the Japanese Navy left, and at that point, well, by the time the Italians bow out, the U-boat menace has largely been contained, but it is still a threat, especially with the development of things like acoustic torpedoes and later on electroboats. So, coin toss at that point. Although the Kriegsmarine U-boat arm is still a threat, its strategic threat level has been somewhat nullified, although the Allies are having to engage in a constant technological arms race to keep that threat contained. Whereas the Japanese, by mid to late 1943, are very much on the back foot and are not really going to recover from it. And they're not forcing the Allies into any kind of major technological arms race, except perhaps in terms of how many 20mm and 40mm can we fit on our ships to shoot down the kamikazes. So, yeah, they're making advances, but they're not quite forcing the issue as much as the Germans. So I'd probably say for the late war, the Kriegsmarine is probably the largest strategic threat, albeit that neither navy is a top-line strategic threat the way that all three of them were to varying degrees in 41 through mid-43. Someone with an unpronounceable name, ZUMKZWXWQ. Anyway, he asks, Speaking of weapons not working as intended, what would a crew at the receiving end do if they found a Mark 14 stuck in their ship that hadn't exploded, or a dud shell? Well, these things can happen. This is a slightly more modern example, courtesy of the Soviet Navy, but nevertheless it illustrates the point quite amusingly and quite well. Now, if it's a dud shell, it depends on the size of the shell and where it is. So there are examples of dud shells ending up in all sorts of weird and wonderful places. I mean, obviously there's the dud that the Bismarck hit Prince of Wales with, but in other battles there were shells that wound up in much more interesting places in the ship. One officer came back to find I think it was a 6-inch shell just waiting for him on the pillow of his bed after it had smashed its way through several intervening bulkheads. So, as I say, size and location are the main things. If it's deep in the ship, you're not going to risk moving it, because the thing is, you don't know why it's a dud. Is it a dud because the fuse never worked? Is it a dud because the fuse partially worked? Is it a dud because the fuse is working but just wasn't activated? Is there something about it that maybe it's part way to detonating and it just needs a slight bit of movement to make it detonate? You don't know. So usually, if you find a big nasty shell somewhere deep in the ship, you just very gently pack it with a lot of things to make sure it's stable and leave it alone until the professionals can be called in, which usually means when you're in port. If it's much higher in the ship, and or it's a fairly small round, then that's slightly different, because if it's man portable or 2-man portable, you can probably gingerly lift it and chuck it overboard. Yeah. And if it's high up in the ship, even if it's a relatively large round, you can, depending on the captain's judgment, make an attempt again to remove and dispose of it, because, well, apart from the men who are obviously putting themselves at risk by trying to move it, if you've got a shell that's fetched up in your superstructure or your accommodation quarters somewhere, you can mostly evacuate the area, make it safe, and if the worst does happen, it's not going to fatally endanger the ship. Whereas, yeah, if you've got a shell that's parked up next to your magazine, very definitely take care about that. And when it comes to torpedoes, matters are slightly different, because, well, if you have a dud torpedo in your hull, there's still going to be a hole in your hull, and that is going to be a problem. Also, if the torpedo is sticking out, then your movement of the ship is going to move that torpedo about, which means you can't stabilize it, which means you're going to have a lot of problems. So if you've got a dud torpedo in the hull, if you can get rid of it, you would. But, as I say, obviously it's going to be causing flooding, so you may end up just having to accept the fact that things stuck in there. Because if the compartment is completely flooded, you're not going to open the bulkhead doors and let more compartments flood. You're just going to have to live with it. Maybe send divers over the side if the situation permits, and get them to very carefully try and extract it. You might even end up detaching the hull plate or cutting around a big hole in the hull plate and letting it drop out that way, because you really want the torpedoes gone. Torpedo has a much, much bigger explosive charge than any naval shell. And, yeah, they also tend to hit more vital parts of the ship, because, again, you don't want water coming in. You can let air come in to a certain degree, but you definitely don't want water coming in. So, if at all possible, get rid as fast as possible. Cameron Sowers asks, specifically relating to this video, did the Navy or Bureau of Ordnance learn any lasting lessons from the Mark 14 debacle? Well, if they learned anything, I can guarantee you they learned not to annoy Admiral King. Because, yeah, boy did he have some words to say. Some of the transcripts of some of his conversations with Bureau of Ordnance thereafter, I think, are probably creatively edited, because it would probably be considered unpublishable at the time. See, this is one of the reasons I definitely don't think Admiral King is in any way all bad. When he got a case where he needed to defend his navy against someone incompetent, even if they technically worked for the same navy, oh boy, yeah, don't annoy Admiral King. Just don't. Not if you value your life. But going forward, sadly, they didn't learn all the lessons they should have. The Mark 18 electric torpedo, which I did mention, I think, in that video, was a good example of that. It's like they literally had a German acoustic homing torpedo to copy, and they managed to make it worse. Stop, please. At least it was only one or two major problems with the Mark 18, not the multiplicity of issues that there were with the Mark 14, but there you go. Small steps, anyway. Once you get into past World War II, as I've said before, my expertise when it comes to missiles and such is not as great. So, yeah, there have been weapons program screw-ups since then in the US Navy. BuOrd itself obviously ceased to exist in the late 50s, and then the whole thing was reorganized twice. So, I guess I'm going to leave that full answer to that one in the comments. So, those of you who I know listen to this and either are serving or have served in the US Navy over the past few decades, as BuOrd or its successor, I think it's NavOrd, and then followed by NavC. So yeah, has stuff from any of them been particularly bad - unreliable? I'm sure a few people will come up with some interesting comments. Lloyd Knighton asks, is it true that the German Kriegsmarine was having similar problems with premature explosions and dud warheads? Yes, both the Royal Navy and the Kriegsmarine experienced issues early on in the war with magnetic detonators, or magnetic pistols, if you like, for their torpedoes that really didn't function as intended, pretty much for similar reasons to the Mark 14, namely that they just weren't calibrated for different strengths in the Earth's magnetic field, or at least the designers either hadn't thought about it or assumed it wouldn't be a problem. Now, the early German torpedoes did have a number of other problems. They also had a very finicky contact detonator, although not quite as bad as the Mark 14. So to give some context to that, in the early part of the war, the German U-boat fired 3 torpedoes at Ark Royal, and all 3 detonated prematurely because of the faulty magnetic detonators. However, the contact detonators seemed to work perfectly fine because a few days later they sunk HMS Courageous with 3 torpedoes that were using contact detonators. Then they used 3 contact detonating torpedoes against HMS Nelson, and the result was some scratched paint, and the torpedoes kind of just smeared themselves across Nelson's side, which wasn't so great. And then during the Norwegian campaign, there were all sorts of shenanigans going on. But the main difference between the German situation particularly and the American situation was that when you had some very irate U-boat captains coming back saying these torpedoes don't work, the Kriegsmarine actually took it seriously and started an investigation, which ended up with the designers of the particular detonators in question being court-martialed and sent to prison. I'm pretty sure there are quite a few families of US submariners who suffered losses as a result of the malfunctioning Mark 14 who would quite have liked to see that fate for a number of BuOrd personnel. Nonetheless, the Germans did also have an additional problem. Now, in the Mark 14 torpedo video, so we'll go over various problems the Mark 14 had, including depth keeping. The Germans also initially had depth keeping issues with some of their torpedoes, but for a completely different reason. It wasn't anything to do with weights, but it was to do with the fact that when a U-boat stayed submerged for extended periods of time, it would periodically release bursts of compressed air to help renew the atmosphere and make sure everyone didn't suffocate, which is a rather important feature of U-boat operation. So this obviously increased the overall pressure in the submarine, and part of the depth keeping gear on a German torpedo was a pressure sensor, as is the case in most torpedoes. However, some of these pressure sensors were being manufactured with faulty seals, and so rather than being set at the standard atmospheric pressure that was present when they were manufactured, the ones with the faulty seals were having their internal pressure gradually increased as the air pressure in the U-boat went up, which then meant when they were launched they gave incorrect readings, which caused the torpedoes to run too deep. Once this issue was discovered, it was also fixed. Antifa Slayer asks, you've mentioned before the loss of Indefatigable was different to the other two battlecruisers at Jutland, and not necessarily just down to a flash in the magazine. How so? So yes, the sinking of HMS Indefatigable is actually quite the interesting subject when you look at it in detail, because, believe it or not, for such a poor victimised ship, there are actually 3 massive explosions at least on the ship. Now, quite often you'll find accounts of the fact that a turret's magazines exploded, blowing the bow off the ship, and this is true, it did happen. However, believe it or not, that wasn't why the ship sank. As you can see in this photo, there's the ship sinking, there's a turret, just about you can see, with some smoke pouring out of it, and there's the bow of the ship. Now, I don't know about you, but I think the ship is pretty much sunk at this point, and the bow is still very much there. The explosion in the magazines of a turret actually happened after this photo was taken, believe it or not. Now, what actually sank Indefatigable was a massive explosion of Y turret magazine, which is the rear magazine. And that happened sometime before it caused the ship to slew out of line, and it was gradually settling by the stern, having, well, lost most of the stern, and then the ship was hit again, and kabang. Now, that's 2 explosions, but what about the third? Well, when you look at the account of the gunnery officer from SMS Von der Tann, he makes some very interesting observations. He notes that there was a salvo, a hit, and the aft turret, i.e. Y turret, exploded. There was massive sheets of flame, what looked to be the roof of the turret going everywhere, etc., etc. Okay, so that's bad, obviously. And you might think, well, surely that's how the magazines detonated. That's pretty much par for the course for the British battlecruisers there on the day. Not quite, because he then goes on to say that the next salvo that they fired, he saw further hit just slightly forward of where the massive explosion went, i.e. Y turret. And then there was a huge roiling black cloud of black smoke, and that was all she wrote. Now, that is pretty much probably the explosion of the magazines. Because, well, that's how most descriptions of magazine explosions go. So what it would appear, bearing in mind that there's only really superstructure and the hull immediately forward of Y turret, is that, yes, a turret was blown up. That happened, definitely, Y turret. However, then another salvo comes in and it hits forward. So it's not hitting the turret, and, well, the turret's already burned out. So where's it going to hit? Well, there's a rather large sort of tower-ish rear superstructure, but there's nothing in there that's going to cause a massive explosion. So when the ship's hit slightly forward of Y turret, that's got to be hit on the main hull. And the part of the 12-inch magazine and then the 4-inch secondary magazine does extend forward of Y turret. And depending on the relative angle the ship's at, you could actually hit a reasonable amount forward and still punch through into the magazine if the shells can get through the armour. And herein lies one of the major problems with, well, the Invincibles and the Indefatigables, but the Indefatigables especially. When you're talking about something like, well, HMS Queen Mary, or HMS Lion, or HMS Tiger, or HMS Princess Royal, their armour, their belt armour, 9 inches thick, was able to repel German shell fire. So a direct penetrating shot to the magazines is incredibly unlikely against those ships. If the safety measures are in place, then a hit to the turret would cause a loss of the turret, but shouldn't cause a loss of the rest of the ship. Now, of course, we know those measures weren't in place, and thus Lion almost died, and Queen Mary did die to turret hits. But Indefatigable only has 4-inch armour over the base of Y turret, over its magazines, and 6-inch armour forward. And the Invincibles, the immediate predecessor class, are 6-inch overall in those areas. Now, whilst German shells from the 11 and 12-inch guns aboard their battlecruisers couldn't penetrate the 9-inch armour at those kinds of battle ranges of the Lion and later battlecruisers, they could definitely punch through 4-inch or 6-inch armour, and thus, although without very detailed examination of the wreck exactly where the detonation occurred, possibly even finding shell holes, you never know, it's not 100% possible to tell. It does seem certainly plausible to me that whilst Indefatigable did lose wide turret, and whilst that may well have crippled her from being able to continue the fight, it probably wasn't the immediate cause of her sinking. The immediate cause of her sinking was almost certainly that second salvo hit that the gunnery officer on Von der Tann saw slightly forward, which probably then did punch into her magazines, and that was that, because those shells could punch through the magazine. So this is why I think the loss of Indefatigable was different, because unlike the later ships, she was vulnerable when facing off against gun calibers of roughly similar to what she carried, of shells just punching clean through her protection at battle ranges, which meant they could just obviate any safety measures, even if they were in place, and go straight for the magazines. And, well, there you go. With Invincible, we know exactly where she was hit because there were a lot of close observations to what happened, but even Invincible could have suffered the same fate if the German shells had hit a bit lower. So, yeah, that would be my argument as to why Indefatigable's loss probably was different. As I say, having not examined the wreck myself, obviously, and without anyone actually physically going down there to examine the wreck, we can't say 100% for certain. But, yeah, the Indefatigable and Invincible class battlecruisers at Jutland were massively, massively more vulnerable to direct magazine detonations than anything else, including the Lion and its derivatives that were present on that day. Nickboy302 asks, AHS Centaur sinking, mistaken identity, conspiracy, or something sinister? So for those of you wondering what on earth I'm going on about, AHS Centaur was the Australian hospital ship Centaur, sunk in 1943, with quite a few medical personnel and civilians on board. Now, as for why they sank a hospital ship, well, I think, to be honest, comes down to two possible explanations. One of which is that given the great range at which the Japanese submarines could strike, and given the range that apparently the Japanese submarine in question did hit the Centaur at, and the overall relative size of the Centaur not being the world's largest vessel, it's entirely possible they may not have actually realised it was a hospital ship, i.e. a case of mistaken identity, because they could have got close enough, but they didn't get close enough to identify the markings. And that's because, at least in theory, the Japanese were still obeying the rules of war in terms of not shooting at hospital ships. However, there is also another factor to consider. The most likely culprit for the sinking was a Japanese submarine that was commanded by a rather nasty piece of work, who, on not one, not two, but 3 separate occasions, ordered the machine gunning of survivors of ships that he had sunk whilst they were in the water after their ships had gone down. And I'm sorry, but somebody who's prepared to repeatedly machine gun innocent sailors in the water, one, they should have bloody well hanged the guy after the war. How on earth he got away with imprisonment, I have no idea. Someone that despicable just deserves to be given a short drop and a quick stop, in my opinion, and I'm sorry, but that's just the way it is. And as you might guess, I would be entirely unsurprised if a man like that decided, you know what, I don't care that it's a hospital ship, I'm going to torpedo it anyway. So yeah, those would be my two guesses. Charitably mistaking an identity, slightly less charitably, that captain probably would have blown it away even if he had known what it was. And as I said, it's just a shame he didn't suffer for the consequences of what he was definitely confirmed to have done. Miko Leitner asks, at what point, if ever, have major naval ships such as cruisers, frigates, capital ships, etc., gained an upper hand against the elements, i.e. when have captains had to stop worrying about storms sinking their ships? Well, no ship is entirely proof to the weather and the elements, and that holds true today as much as it's held true at any point in time. Now, there are caveats to that, obviously. I mean, wonderfully illustrated by this Arleigh-Burke-class destroyer, who is clearly doing its level best to follow its captain's orders to dive. Presumably the captain's a former submariner, but never mind. Now, yes, there are varying factors. If you're talking about a storm in the open ocean, that's a very different matter to a storm in coastal waters, for example, because a large ship, a heavy cruiser or a battleship or something that's just wandering around in open water has a lot less to fear from a storm, even if it's shoved completely off course, than, say, a ship of exactly the same type that's caught in exactly the same storm but is close to home or close to the shore, because in the middle of the ocean, it doesn't really matter if the storm kicks you 50 miles east of where you wanted to be. But if you're offshore and the shore's 10 miles away, well, being kicked 50 miles east, you're going to end up on the shore on the rocks somewhere, and that's not a good thing, because the rocks very definitely will put down pretty much any ship that they can, especially in a storm. Now, when it comes to other elements, you've also got to think about stuff like, say, the Arctic, or the Antarctic for that matter. A storm there might well cause massive amounts of ice to build up on the upperworks of the ship, making it less stable, and may also involve large chunks of ice being flung around in the ocean, which can do very bad things to a ship's watertight integrity. And combined between them, I can easily see a really bad Arctic storm even toppling the mightiest of battleships. So, yeah, in that respect, no ship is weatherproof. Even if you took the USS Ford up into the Arctic Circle in the middle of a really, really powerful storm, there's every chance you could fatally injure the ship. But it has got progressively less likely as time goes on. It's, at least with the larger vessels. Destroyers, of course, can still be, or at least in World War II, could still be overwhelmed by the weather. A number of US destroyers were lost in Typhoon Cobra for that reason. And even today, modern frigates and destroyers displace sort of light to heavy-ish cruiser displacements most of the time, so they're still vulnerable as well. But yeah, if you were going to confine it to purely ocean storms, i.e. big waves and wind, without any of the environmental factors of the Arctic or being offshore or something like that, yeah, the heavy cruisers, battleships, that kind of thing are pretty much weatherproof. So at that point, you're looking at around about early 1900s to be properly guaranteed to be safe against most forms of purely sea storm-based weather. Now, that's not to say you can just sit there and go, aha, I am invincible, because you're definitely not. If you take a big ship broadside in a big to the waves in a big storm, you're still going to end up upside down. That's just the way the physics goes. So you still have to captain the ship well, head into the waves, or basically head 90 degrees to the waves one way or the other, but you're better off heading into them. And also just hope you don't run into a monster wave, because those are definitely a thing. And yes, ships have been hit by monster waves and survived, but equally ships have been hit by monster waves and not survived. So just because you're in a big ship, I wouldn't necessarily want to be hit by one, or I want to bet against it, especially since warships carry explosives, and being hit by that much water might bounce something hard enough to set off something that goes bang, paradoxically, considering you're being hit by massive amounts of, as I say, freezing cold water. But there you go. I just love this picture. Someone needs to put a little, make it a little GIF, one of those little animated picture things with the waves. Just put a little submarine siren on it, and just someone just going, dive, dive, dive. Captain, I said dive. Oh, what a great photo. David Toyne asks, In Jellicoe's book, The Grand Fleet 1914-16, Its Creation, Development and Work, published in 1919, he presents the position that the main reason for Royal Navy capital ship losses at Jutland was due to the inadequate or inferior armour. Was he holding the line here, or is it fair to say that he wasn't aware of or did not consider poor ammunition handling to be a key factor? When did the poor ammunition handling findings really gather impetus? So, Jellicoe makes a number of points regarding armour and armour protection in his book. But the thing is, you have to read the whole thing, unfortunately, to get a good sense of what he's saying. He points out that he does attribute the loss of some of the ships to inadequate armour, but if you look very carefully, you'll notice he talks about the armour protection in the earlier battle cruisers being inadequate. And, well, actually, ironically, given the question about Indefatigable a couple of questions back, he's right. the Invincibles and Indefatigables, and, well, the half of them that were left afterwards, definitely were inadequately protected armour-wise to stand up in a gunfight with other ships of their own gun caliber, regardless of any ammunition handling facility issues or anything like that. Later on in the book, when he actually lists the primary lessons of the conflict of that particular battle, he actually lists the need for better flash protection against cordite charges as the first priority. Armour doesn't actually get mentioned until point 3, when he talks about the need for a more extensive deck protection to protect magazines from splinters and such like, but that's primarily, again, aimed at older designs of ship that he considers not to have full and proper deck protection in light of modern combat paradigms. So, yeah, although he is talking about armour, he isn't attributing the loss of all the capital ship losses as inadequate armour, and he does acknowledge the cordite flash handling issue, especially as the priority lesson that has to be learned. So yeah, it's something you have to look through the whole book to understand. Fortunately, I have a copy, so I was able to spend a good few hours perusing it to make sure I had all those points lined up. Now, obviously, yeah, there were other issues with regards to both the reports at the time, which he acknowledges. Some things were edited out of the reports during the war, and to a certain extent, even though they are his post-war reflections as a still-serving naval officer, and it only being 3 years down the line, he may still personally have been holding a few bits and pieces back from the general public for operational security reasons. There is a rather wonderful article including significant amounts of primary sources called A Direct Train of Cordite over on the Dreadnought project, which I'll link in the video description below, which actually, it doesn't discuss Jellicoe's book specifically, but it does discuss the correspondence that was going back and forth in the immediate aftermath of Jutland, and it can be seen from there that the Royal Navy as a whole had generally cottoned on to the ammunition handling issue pretty quickly after the battle. And whilst there were a few shenanigans surrounding exactly how widely they wanted certain elements of the Admiralty wanted that to be publicly known, from an operational perspective, it certainly was something that they picked up on pretty quickly. The main thing, to be perfectly honest, is that there are two competing narratives. You've got the factual base one, which the Royal Navy picked up, as I write early, and Jellicoe picked up and addressed in his book, and which is backed up by most of the evidence, which is the poor ammunition handling parts. But you also have Beatty with his stint as First Sea Lord and such like, who's desperately trying to make sure that nobody questions how he ran the battle. And given how that it was his ships that exploded and not Jellicoe's, it would be then in his interest to mention things about armour protection not being adequate, because, well, he couldn't do anything about the armour protection. He was just dealing with the ships that he was given. And wasn't that Admiral Jellicoe who was at various points before the war in charge of ship design and construction, or at least had a good deal of authority over it? Oh yes, it was. So maybe we should all be looking at him and not me. And yeah, that's kind of, since he was such a great self-publicist, old BT, that's kind of coloured the debate. And also the fact that, as I mentioned, there were legitimate acknowledgements of certain deficiencies in armour protection in certain ship classes. That kind of clouds the whole issue as well when you're evaluating the claims of the two opposing parties. Alan Millard asks, what film made post-World War II do you think has the most realistic portrayal of naval combat? So, I've answered similar questions before, but I've still got to hand it to Das Boot. It remains a superlative film about naval combat in World War II, albeit that it is obviously told from the point of view of a submarine, so not necessarily the all guns blazing scenario that you might otherwise think of. But yeah, if you want to get a good idea of what at least submarine naval combat in World War II was like, you can't go wrong with a good old session of Das Boot. But I think as well, albeit that the battle sequences are massively accelerated, you've got to give an honourable mention to Sink the Bismarck. Now, as I say, obviously, they have the entire battle between Rodney, King George V and Bismarck condensed down to about 5 minutes or so, wherein in reality it took a lot longer than that, and obviously there's various ships missing, such as the heavy cruisers. But points for using actual footage of actual naval guns being loaded, points for using the correct terminology, and mostly the correct attitude of the naval officers going on. But more than anything else, I think, with this is that although, as I say, the sequence itself is accelerated, and, well, it's the 1960s, so there's a limited amount of CGI they can do. For the fact they're having to work with 1950 to 1960s era model work, it's a pretty darn good battle, visually, and especially towards the second half of Bismarck's final battle, there are a few movies that I've seen that actually give a fairly straight up and honest portrayal, at least as much as you can, without going completely up the rating system for the horrible mess that it would entail, of actually demonstrating what it's like to be on a battleship that is being shelled to bits. And I think this is something that, if you're going to tell a story like this, you do have to tell. And that is what really bumps it up the scale for me. Because at the end of the day, yes, we can all make pretty PG-13 or 12 rated movies where the ship is viewed as just this inanimate object that is the threat, and it gets blown up and everybody's happy and everyone goes home for tea and medals because the threat has been neutralized. But at the end of the day, every single one of the battleships that was sunk, and many of them with most, or possibly in some cases all hands, were home to thousands of men. And they didn't want really to be there when all of that was going down. Yes, they signed up to fight, but no one signs up to be on a several tens of thousands of ton steel behemoth while it's gradually being pounded to pieces by incoming shell fire. If you think about it at all, you sign up to do that to somebody else. And whilst, yes, something like Bismarck or Kirishima or any other capital ship sunk in action was definitely a threat to the side that sank it, the Sink the Bismarck does actually make sure to point out that, yeah, it's not just about the, yes, we blew up the ship, it is about the fact that people die when this happens. There is a price to be paid on both sides, and we always have to remember and acknowledge that. So yeah, hence why for me, Sink the Bismarck definitely gets up there with an honourable mention. And why I think anyone who tries to do another film that covers the story of the Bismarck is going to have a very high bar to clear. And that brings us to the end of Drydock episode 97. So thank you very much for listening. Just a few bits of channel admin before we go. So for those of you who might be wondering what happened to that treaty cruiser design competition way back at the beginning of the year. Well, various things happened. The lockdown happened. All sorts of fun things in the day job happened. mostly to do with coronavirus and having to deal with the fallout of that, plus the usual work. And yeah, and obviously having to deal with fighting with various airlines and hotels to try and get money back from the having to cancel the USA trip, some successful, some not so much. Yeah, there's been a lot that's been going on, and unfortunately, well, that's the unfortunate part. The fortunate part, is, which is kind of a two-edged sword, is that so many of you sent in entries, and a lot of them were good, which meant that the judging process, even though I have had some assistance with that, has been ongoing. I had definitely haven't forgotten about it. It is still a thing that's happening. It's just taken a lot longer. And yeah, I am probably going to have to revise how I'm going to be doing these competitions going forward because, yeah, this is a little bit of a delay. But the good news is that hopefully by the next Drydock, well, in fact, definitely by the next Drydock, we will have the winners announced. And I'll hopefully also have some idea of how we're going to do this going forward in a slightly more organised fashion. So, yeah, there's that. As far as the aforementioned USA trip goes, well, I was kind of hoping at the time that I had to cancel it that maybe we'd have a clearer idea of how things would develop going forwards with an objective to try and rebook everything for maybe late September, early October this year. But, well, we are still in lockdown, coronavirus is still a thing, and we are still looking at not exactly knowing when it's all going to be safe. So, unfortunately, when it comes to that, I really don't know at the moment what's going to happen with that. I will make that trip at some point, bar the apocalypse, obviously. But I think I'm going to have to make a judgment call by the end of this month. If things haven't got some clearer definition as to what's going to happen by the end of this month, then I may have to just go, right, well, here's the template. We were looking at doing it kind of around Easter time. We may have to then just go for doing it Easter time next year. That would be annoying, but there's been a fair financial hit in the money I haven't been able to recoup from this time around, so I'm not necessarily keen to repeat that experience twice without some decent guarantees that there's a better chance than even that it will actually happen. But with that said, things in Europe seem to be calming down slightly, so if it's not possible to do the USA trip this year, then I will try and substitute in a series of small European trips to have a look at various museum ships such as Georgia Savarov, Bliskovica, etc., etc. And as and when, if that happens, I will let people know, obviously, just in case you, for whatever weird reason, want to come along and say hello to someone who's running around with a ton of camera equipment. But there you go. Anyway, that wraps up, I think, everything for today. Thank you very much for listening, if indeed you still are, and I hope to see you again in another video.